How to succeed in drawing from the imagination. There really are two main ways I think we can draw, and that's we draw from a reference, whether it's an object in front of us or from a photo, or we draw from our imagination. We don't have anything that is physical that we can see, but we're drawing from the memories that we have and that we create. In lots of ways, drawing from a reference is fairly straightforward. We're seeing something, whether we're actually trying to draw it exactly or approximately exactly, or whether we're using it as a springboard to make some changes as we go. We have at least our starting point, if not what we're trying to do in front of us. But when we draw from imagination, we don't. We have to find everything we need in our mind, in our thinking. So what's the process of drawing from imagination? How different is it to drawing from references? And how can I be successful if drawing from imagination is what I want or I need to do? And particularly whether I illustrate comics, where I need to create scenes that are based on some sort of narrative. And so I need to create figures and backgrounds that actually tie in with the story, not with something I'm seeing. How can I make that work where there is no direct observation at that point for exactly what I'm wanting? Well, let me start by saying that actually I think there is observation. There's just as much observation in drawing from imagination as there is drawing from life or from a photo. It's just that when I draw from my imagination, it's not happening at the same time as I've made the observation that I need to draw from. See, if I draw a tree from my imagination, what's happening? Well, in a way, I'm creating a tree that doesn't really exist anywhere. But in order to do that, I have to go back to memories of trees that I've collected. I have to go back to trees that I've seen, whether in life or in a photo or in someone else's illustrations, but I have to go back to trees that I have seen somehow to collect all the information that I will need to now create my own tree for a particular context. And it's not just how a tree looks, it's how particular trees look, and it's also how particular trees look under certain circumstances, whether they're lighting circumstances, whether they're perspective circumstances. And then there's also the more technique-driven ways of how tree drawings look according to how they sit and function in our overall drawing. All of these things I need to have observed in the past so that in my mind, I've got all the information I need to pull out what I need to draw whatever I need to draw. And even if I want to draw some sort of stylized, some sort of non-figurative tree, I'm still using memories of real trees as my starting point. The observation still has to have happened and be there for me to draw. And so the obvious place to go from here is that if I want to have successful drawings from my imagination, I need to have collected the memories that I need to be able to draw successfully, whatever that means for my drawing style and intention. I think of it as I need to put the books into my imagination library that I will consult when I need to draw something from imagination, because I can't draw what's not there. If I were to say to you, draw me a picture of the Titanic sailing out of Cherbourg Harbour, probably a lot of you could draw a ship of some sort. Probably a lot of you could even draw a ship that looks like it's a 1912 Atlantic liner. But how many could actually draw a picture that you could identify as the Titanic? Would you know whether it had 3 or 4 funnels? Would you know the shape of the bow or the shape of the stern? Would you know how many lifeboats to put down the boat deck? Would you know how many decks there are? For most of us, we wouldn't actually have the specific visual information, the memories of exactly what the Titanic looks like to be able to do that, even if we could actually easily recognize the Titanic from a photo of other similar liners at the same period. That doesn't mean that we've got the specific information we need to be able to draw it credibly. You may have heard me say in talking about drawing from photos that if our drawing doesn't look right, the problem is almost certainly not a lack of drawing skills, but that we never observed in our photo or in front of us what we needed to see to actually draw it correctly. And when there are problems with the drawings I've done from my imagination, I would say that the main problem is almost certainly exactly the same, except instead of observing the reference in front of me accurately enough, carefully enough, finding the things I need to find, I haven't observed well enough for the memories that I've then stored in my imagination drawing library to be able to reference them and to come up with accurate drawings. Or maybe I simply don't have enough books in my library to refer to. And so I'm looking at things that in my mind that aren't really helpful for what I'm trying to draw. But either way, the problem is I don't have stored in my imagination what I need. And the interesting thing I find is that when I look at drawings that have been drawn from the imagination that aren't quite right, and when I look at drawings that have been drawn from photos or from life that don't look quite right, the sorts of mistakes, the sorts of errors that I see, the sorts of things that just don't look quite right are so often exactly the same things, because the observation in each case was inadequate. So I see buildings drawn with perspective angles, where as the building goes higher, yes, the horizontal sidelines are angled, but the angles basically stay parallel. They don't increase as they get higher. And that's always an observation error. When I look at drawings of faces of people, I see all the features arranged quite well, but not nearly enough room to the top of the head or to the chin. And if the head's turned side on, there's not nearly enough space here as there is here. And they're observation skills, because we don't notice as carefully the parts of something that we're looking at that don't interest us as much. We think we've seen what's there, but we haven't actually looked. We've looked only with what's necessary for everyday life and living and interaction, but not enough for the parts that we perceive in everyday life aren't as important. When I'm looking at a person, this is what I'm seeing most closely, most intensely. This is what I'm focused on almost all the time. I'm not really usually focused on the distance from the eyes to the top of the head or from the ears, say, to the back of the skull. But because I think I've observed enough and I think I know what's happening there, I think I can draw it. And it's my drawing that proves that I haven't yet done enough observation. So how do we overcome this, particularly if we're drawing from our imagination? Firstly, it's very helpful to understand the process. I'm not really making it up. It's just that I'm going into my memory of the things that I'm drawing, and I'm drawing from there. That's the process. So therefore, if I find that I can't reach and find what I need, then I need to restock my library, or I need to buy more up-to-date books, or books that are more specifically tailored to what I'm actually trying to draw from my imagination now. That it's not a problem with my drawing skills. I simply don't understand enough what I'm trying to draw. Can I say, from my mind and experience, it's clearly much harder to draw from imagination than it is to draw from something we see in front of us. It's far more challenging, and I take my hat off to people where this is their main way of drawing. Because if this is what I'm doing, I need to collect enough memories strongly enough that I can draw on them when I'm drawing. I need to be able to hold them in my mind for a much longer period of time than the very short period of time between observing a reference that's right next to my sheet of paper and then translating that somehow in my mind to marks and putting those marks on the paper. Much more challenging to be having to remember back to things that I may have seen quite some time ago. And I still need to understand all the things that we all need to understand. So I need to understand how perspective will affect what I'm drawing from the angle I'm drawing it from. If I'm drawing a figure, I need to understand the difference between an arm that's viewed this way and an arm that's viewed this way, and how perspective changes that. Or if I'm at the ground looking up at a figure, or above looking down on a figure, as opposed to just looking at a figure. I need to understand how all these things apply, not just to architecture, but to everything that's going to be in my square, in my drawing, within my frame. I need to understand shade and shadow, and I need to understand the particular things for the subjects that I'm drawing. And I need to have enough of this in my mind that I've seen and studied to understand how it might look in, if you like, any direction, from any angle, under any conditions. But while this is, I think, much more difficult to do than drawing from a photo, fundamentally the processes are the same. The problem when I draw from a photo is if I don't observe carefully enough and I start to draw what I think I've seen, or more commonly, what I've seen in the past, seen in a way sufficient for everyday life, but not for drawing. And I let that influence what I see in the photo. If I'm drawing a car and the car is very slightly turned away from me, so that the tire is actually a slight ellipse, it's hard to sometimes overcome the fact that I know and that I've seen and that I remember tires straight on so that they're circular. And so I'm tempted to draw on that memory more and make my wheel rounder than it should be, more of a circle and less of an ellipse. This is the way that my memories can start to distort even what I'm seeing in front of me in my reference. How much more when we draw without the reference, when we're entirely dependent on what we're remembering, that we have enough information that we can remember accurately for this object in this way what we need to draw. So to draw, I think, successfully from our imagination, we have to make sure we input all the information that we need to draw on, that we study the things that influence how what we want to draw might look, that we study how perspective affects the way figures or buildings or trees look, that we study how we can capture the effect of distance, how perspective will work for any angle that we think we might want to be drawing from in relation to our figures. And that just as we do with any drawing, when I finish my drawing, I examine it carefully to see, does it look awkward? Does it look not quite right in some way? And if so, why? How? Because these are the things that will help me pinpoint where I'm lacking the information stored in my imagination library to draw on. But I would suggest that we also fill the imagination library in our mind, not just by observing and reading, but when we draw. If I ask myself, what can I most successfully draw from my imagination today? It's all the subjects that I have most successfully and most frequently drawn from references. So, trees and buildings. I find them much easier to draw from my imagination than, say, a figure, because I know that I lack the information I need to do it well. I would need to start to study anatomy and start to practice drawing figures from references first in all sorts of extreme poses to help me understand exactly how things such as perspective and lighting and whatnot affect figures rather than trees and buildings. I know the principle, and I could do, if you like, a recognizable job, but it still may not look quite right. And what I need to do is to go back to actual references, and from those actual references start to capture all the information I need to capture, and to train my mind to understand that I need that information and I need to use it from real life, so that then I've got that to extrapolate into whatever imaginative position, poses, scene I'm trying to create for the particular story or purpose that I have. And I would go as far as saying that I actually can't draw from my imagination something that I can't draw well from a reference. Because if you like, it's the lesser demand on me. Even though there is, I think, a surprising amount of overlap in how that process works, it's being carried to a much more demanding level when we draw from our imagination. So I'd say to someone drawing from their imagination but not being satisfied with what they've drawn, to go back to drawing from references, particularly for those specific subjects and poses that they're having trouble with, and to focus on learning to observe within an easier context, and then to capture that observation in an easier context before then trying to do it in a more difficult context. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. I hope this has been helpful or interesting. If so, please hit the like button for me. Drawing from imagination is, I think, a real challenge. It's really pushing ourselves much further in what we need to draw on within ourselves than we need when we have a reference in front of us. And it really is an essential skill for a lot of drawing contexts, such as creating comics and so forth. I hope my take on what this process actually is and how it relates to drawing from photos has been helpful for anyone wanting to draw from their imagination or wanting to improve their drawing from their imagination. But look, whatever we draw, however we draw it, however it turns out, let's make sure we keep having fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.